There's a pattern that I see again and again in my work, and when I say again and again, I mean it's become one of the most consistent things that I encounter, almost like a reliable signature of a particular moment in a woman's health journey. A woman arrives, usually in her mid to late 40s, sometimes early 50s. She's health literate, she's been paying attention to all the health stuff out there. She knows more than most people about how sleep works, about why morning light matters, about the importance of consistent meal timing. She's been putting in the effort for months, sometimes years, and that effort was paying off. Her sleep was improving, her energy was more stable, she felt like she'd finally worked out what her body actually needed. And then perimenopause arrives properly and everything stopped working. Not gradually, not in a way that she could sort of track and troubleshoot, but it's just that the things that had been working had stopped working. And her sleep became fragmented in a way that it hadn't been before. Her energy, which had been reliably improving, started dropping out without warning. She was waking in the early hours of the morning and lying there for an hour, sometimes two, before sleep eventually returned or the alarm went off. Her mood was less stable. Her thinking felt cloudier than it used to. She felt like she was back at square one, basically, except now she didn't have the comfort of not knowing what to do. She knew what to do, she was doing it, and it wasn't working. I'm doing the same things that I know worked for me is a phrase that I hear quite often. The same exact things I was doing before, so why isn't anything landing the same way anymore? And sometimes it comes out of frustration, sometimes as genuine confusion, sometimes as something closer to self-doubt, sort of wondering about whether she's actually been doing things right all along, or whether she'd been just fooling herself and everything was a placebo effect. And that part, when I hear it, is the thing that most needs correcting, because the failure she's been experiencing isn't a failure of her effort or her knowledge or her consistency. It's a description of what happens when the hormonal scaffolding that kept her circadian rhythm stable starts to shift. I want to say something clearly before we go into the science as well, because I think it really matters. The women I'm describing are not doing things wrong. They're not missing something obvious. They're not catastrophizing or being impatient. They are genuinely experiencing a genuine change that affects the way their body responds to the inputs they've been providing. And nobody has explained the mechanism to them. The frustration and confusion is completely appropriate given the information they've been given, which is that these strategies work, and if they're not working for you, keep doing them, without any account of why the same strategies might feel less effective during a specific hormonal transition, even when applied correctly. So this episode is an attempt to fill that gap. Her body clock's not broken, it's become less robust, and the same inputs that were sufficient before are no longer sufficient for a system that's lost some of its internal stabilisation. The reason everything stopped working isn't that she's been doing it wrong, it's that perimenopause changed the conditions under which everything works. And that distinction between doing it wrong and needing to understand the changed terrain is what this entire episode is about. Welcome back to Quantum Nourishment. I'm Frances, and before we go any further, if you want the complete foundation for everything I cover in this series, there's a free masterclass at francesnorgate.com/masterclass. It's about an hour long and walks you through all 4 pillars together. So it's worth it if you're new here or wanting the full picture. So that's at francesnorgate.com/masterclass. But you don't need it to follow today's episode. So let's get started. My name is Frances Norgate. I'm a certified nutrition and lifestyle advisor, currently completing my BSc in nutritional therapy. Everything I do sits at the intersection of circadian biology and nutrition, understanding how your body's internal timing system governs your energy, your hormones, your metabolism, and your sleep, and what happens when that system loses its anchor. This isn't medical advice, so if you have any specific health concerns, including around perimenopause, please do work with your healthcare provider. And if you're currently on HRT or considering it, this episode isn't arguing against that at all. It's about what sits underneath the hormonal picture, regardless of what you decide to do about HRT. So I want to start with a question that I think is at the heart of the perimenopausal experience for a lot of women, and it's a question that almost nobody is really asking clearly. The question isn't, what are my hormone levels, or should I be on HRT, or even how do I manage my symptoms? The question is, why did everything stop working? Because for most women I come across who are navigating perimenopause, the most destabilizing part of the experience isn't the symptoms themselves, it's the loss of predictability, it's the fact that the strategies and habits and approaches to health that were working reliably and consistently working suddenly aren't working anymore. And that loss of reliability shakes something quite fundamental, because if you can't trust what used to work, then what do you trust? What I find so striking as well is how consistently these women describe their experience in the same terms, not similar terms, but really the same. There's the unpredictability of mornings, waking up feeling relatively functional some days and completely hollowed out on others, with no obvious difference in what happened the night before. There's the sleep that's technically happening. They're in bed for 7 or 8 hours, but the sleep doesn't feel restorative in the way it used to. There's the cognitive inconsistency, sharp on some days, foggy and slow on others, with nothing to explain the difference. And there's the particular frustration of having tried the things that helped before and finding they no longer help in the same way. These three things, fragmented sleep, unpredictable morning energy, and cognitive inconsistency, are almost always described as separate problems. The sleep is treated as a sleep problem, the energy is treated as a nutrition or stress problem, the brain fog is treated a focus or cognitive load problem. And a woman who is doing her research might be addressing all three things separately with different tools for each one without realizing that they share an underlying architecture. There's also a version of this that gets explained as your hormones are declining, so of course things feel harder, which is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't actually explain the mechanism. It doesn't tell you why the morning light that was improving your sleep has stopped improving your sleep, or why the meal timing that was stabilizing your energy has stopped stabilizing your energy, or why you're waking at 3 a.m. again when that pattern had resolved itself. It doesn't give you anything actionable. It just tells you that something has gone wrong hormonally and implies that until the hormones are addressed, either by getting through the transition or by taking HRT, there's not much to be done. And that framing is incomplete. And for women who are motivated, health literate, and already doing a great deal, it's also demoralizing in a way that isn't warranted. They're not separate problems, they're expressions of the same disruption, a disruption to the circadian system that underpins all three of them. And the reason that disruption is happening is something most perimenopause content doesn't touch at all. It's that estrogen isn't just a reproductive hormone, it's one of the primary stabilisers of your circadian clock. When estrogen declines, and in perimenopause it doesn't decline smoothly, it fluctuates wildly before eventually falling, the body clock becomes less robust. Not broken, but less robust. The same external signals that were sufficient to keep your rhythm anchored and stable when estrogen was adequate are no longer sufficient for a system that's lost some of its internal stabilisation. You need more consistent inputs to get the same output. You need to be more deliberate about the things that used to happen more automatically. And that's the frame for everything in this episode. Perimenopause doesn't make circadian health irrelevant, it makes it more important. The interventions we've been covering in this series, morning light, meal timing, evening light management, nervous system regulation, these things matter more during perimenopause, not less. The threshold for what's sufficient has shifted, but the direction of travel is still exactly the same. So let me explain why. Most people understand estrogen primarily in terms of reproductive function. It regulates the menstrual cycle, it supports fertility, it maintains bone density and cardiovascular health. All of that is true and important, but estrogen also has a role that almost never gets mentioned in standard perimenopause conversations. It directly modulates the function of your master circadian clock. Your master clock, as we've covered in previous episodes, sits in a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in your hypothalamus in your brain, two tiny clusters of approximately 20,000 neurons each sitting just above the point where the optic nerves cross. It's the central coordinator of your entire circadian system. The thing that tells your cortisol when to peak, tells your melatonin when to rise, tells your metabolism when to be active and when to wind down, tells your immune system when to run its maintenance routines. Everything that operates on a 24-hour cycle is being timed by this structure. Your body temperature, your blood pressure, your hunger hormones, your ability to concentrate, all of it orchestrated by this tiny hypothalamic region in your brain. And estrogen receptors are densely expressed throughout the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is not a minor detail. Estrogen isn't just floating around doing reproductive things and incidentally passing through the hypothalamus. It's actively involved in how the master clock functions. It influences the expression of core clock genes, the molecular machinery that keeps the 24-hour rhythm running, and specifically, research suggests estrogen interacts with the period and cryptochrome gene families, the gene whose protein products form the negative feedback loops that generate the molecular oscillation underlying circadian rhythm. So when estrogen is present, it appears to help stabilize the amplitude of these molecular oscillations. When it's absent or reduced, these oscillations can become less robust. The peaks are less pronounced, the troughs are less pronounced, and the whole cycle is less crisp. So estrogen also affects how strongly the master clock responds to light signals. The retinohypothalamic tract, the pathway that carries light information from the eye to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is modulated by estrogenic signaling. This means that when estrogen is adequate, the morning light signals is received and translated into a downstream hormonal cascade with relatively high fidelity. But when estrogen is reduced, the sensitivity of that pathway changes. The same light signal may produce a less reliable downstream effect, which is, in my experience, exactly what women describe. The morning light that was making a clear difference has somehow stopped making the same difference, even though they're doing it the same way. Now, let me offer an analogy that I think captures this quite well. So your circadian clock is like a finely tuned pendulum. The pendulum has its own natural rhythm. It wants to swing at a certain rate, but in the real world, pendulums need a small amount of energy added regularly to keep swinging at full amplitude. And without that input, they dampen. The swings get smaller, the rhythm becomes less pronounced. Estrogen, in this analogy, is part of what has been keeping that pendulum swinging at full amplitude. It's been providing some of the internal energetic support that keeps the clock running robustly. When estrogen declines, the pendulum loses some of that support. The rhythm doesn't stop, but it dampens. The peak gets less pronounced, the troughs get less pronounced, the whole system becomes less crisp and less reliable and more easily perturbed. And here's what that means in practice. When your circadian rhythm is running at full amplitude with adequate hormonal support, it can absorb disruption without losing its anchor. A late night, a missed morning routine, a stressful week, these things affect the rhythm temporarily, but the clock snaps back. The system is robust enough to recover quickly. When the rhythm is dampened, it can't absorb the same level of disruption. The same late night that used to cost you one bad morning now costs you 3 days. The missed morning routine that was inconsequential before now has downstream effects that last into the following week. The stress that your nervous system used to process and move through now lingers in ways that it didn't before. And this is why perimenopause feels so destabilizing, even when, or especially when you're doing everything right. The problem isn't that your interventions have stopped working. The problem is that the system they're supporting has become more fragile. The threshold for what counts as sufficient has moved. And there's something else worth naming here. So estrogen doesn't exist in isolation in the circadian system. It interacts with other signaling molecules, notably serotonin and dopamine, both of which are involved in mood, motivation, and the reward systems that make it feel worthwhile to maintain healthy habits. Serotonin is a precursor to melatonin, and estrogen influences serotonin transporter expression and serotonin receptor sensitivity. So when estrogen declines, the serotonin pathway is affected, and with it, the melatonin pathway that serotonin feeds into. This is part of why mood and cognitive changes of perimenopause feel so entangled with the sleep and energy changes. They share the same upstream biology. There's one more layer to the estrogen circadian story that I think is worth including here as well, because it explains something that women often find confusing: why the experience can feel worse some weeks and better others, even when hormones are supposedly just declining. The answer is that estrogen in perimenopause doesn't decline in a smooth downward slope. It fluctuates, sometimes dramatically, sometimes quite wildly, before the longer-term decline takes hold. So some months estrogen peaks higher than it did in your reproductive years. Some months it will drop very low. The follicles are still attempting to recruit and mature, but the process has become less coordinated and the hormonal environment around it is correspondingly chaotic. And this matters for the circadian picture because the circadian disruption you experience is correlated not just with low estrogen, but with unpredictable estrogen. A stable, low level of estrogen would be easier for the circadian system to adapt to than wildly fluctuating levels, which means that the weeks when you feel most destabilized may not be the weeks when estrogen is lowest. They may be the weeks of sharpest fluctuation. The system hasn't had time to adapt to a new baseline. It's being hit with a constantly moving target, and that's a harder situation for the circadian clock to work with than a gradual, consistent change would be. And understanding this also helps explain why the perimenopausal experience often feels more chaotic than postmenopausal life, even though the postmenopausal hormonal environment is lower overall. Once estrogen stabilises, even at a lower level, the circadian system can adapt to new conditions. It may need more external support. The threshold for sufficient light, sufficient meal timing consistency, sufficient nervous system recovery will be higher, but it's a stable set of conditions and the clock can calibrate to them. The transition itself is the hardest part, partly because the hormonal signal the clock has been receiving for decades is suddenly unreliable. This also explains something that I think is really important and doesn't get said often enough. The experience of perimenopause is not uniform. Some women sail through it. Some find it completely derails their functioning for years, and a significant part of what determines which camp you fall into is the state of your circadian rhythm going in and how deliberately you support it through the transition. So a woman with a well-anchored circadian rhythm, consistent light exposure, stable meal timing, and a nervous system that isn't chronically activated has more resilience in the system when estrogen starts fluctuating. The pendulum has more amplitude to dampen before things fall apart. A woman whose circadian rhythm was already fragile going into perimenopause, already disrupted by years of indoor mornings, irregular eating, chronic stress, poor sleep, has much less buffer. So the same hormonal shift will hit much harder. This is absolutely not about blame. Most women arrive at perimenopause without knowing any of this, but it does mean that what you do now matters, both for navigating the transition more smoothly and for the long-term health outcomes on the other side of it. So let me get more specific about the mechanisms, because I think it helps to understand exactly what's happening rather than just knowing that things get harder. There are three main ways that declining estrogen disrupts circadian function, and they need to compound each other in ways that make the overall experience feel chaotic, even when each individual change seems manageable on paper. The first is what happens to the cortisol awakening response. So we talked about this in episode 3, I believe. The cortisol awakening response is the sharp morning peak in cortisol that occurs roughly 30 to 45 minutes after waking. It's not simply stress cortisol, it's a distinct time-sensitive release that serves a specific function. It's what mobilizes glucose, primes the immune system, consolidates recent memories, and initiates the metabolic and hormonal cascade that defines your energy trajectory for the next 16 or so hours. It's one of the most reliable markers of well-functioning HPA axis and well-anchored circadian clock. And estrogen directly influences the amplitude of this response. It does this through several pathways. It affects corticotropic releasing hormone sensitivity in the hypothalamus, the upstream signal that eventually triggers cortisol release from the adrenal glands. It influences glucocorticoid receptor expression, which affects how the body responds to and downregulates cortisol. And it modulates how robustly the HPA axis responds to the morning light signal that ideally calibrates the cortisol awakening response each day. When estrogen is adequate, the cortisol awakening response tends to be crisp and well-timed. When estrogen fluctuates or declines, though, the response becomes more variable. So some mornings it fires well, some mornings it's blunted, which is the morning you wake up feeling completely flat, like you've never really got going. Some mornings it fires at the wrong time, too early, which is part of what drives that 3 a.m. waking we covered in episode 5, where cortisol rises prematurely and pulls you out of the later stages of sleep. The variability, it's worth pausing on this because I think it's the thing that causes the most confusion. It's not that the cortisol awakening response is consistently poor, which would at least be predictable and something you could build around. It's that it's unpredictable. Some days you wake up feeling relatively okay. Some days you wake up feeling like you haven't slept at all, even when you have. And you genuinely can't identify what was different between those 2 mornings because often nothing external was different. The difference was in the hormonal environment, which you didn't control and couldn't see coming. The second mechanism is what happens to melatonin. Estrogen has a complex relationship with melatonin production, so it influences the sensitivity of the pineal gland to the light-dark cycle, and it affects the timing and amplitude of the melatonin rise in the evening. The mechanism involves estrogen's influence on a rate-limiting enzyme in melatonin synthesis. When estrogenic signaling is adequate, this enzyme is expressed with appropriate rhythmicity, but when estrogen declines, the rhythmicity of the enzyme can become less robust. And the melatonin rise in the evening may be flatter and the peak might be lower. And the duration of the elevated melatonin phase might shorten as well. So what does that feel like when people experience it? Well, it feels like not being able to fall asleep easily, even when you're genuinely tired. You're exhausted, you lie down, and somehow sleep doesn't arrive. It feels like waking in the middle of the night and not being able to get back to sleep because the melatonin that should be sustaining the sleep state is insufficient. It feels like waking up earlier than you want to and not feeling rested. It's not classic insomnia in the sense of lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, which is why many women don't recognize it as an insomnia type problem. It's more fragmented, more variable, more resistant to the usual fixes precisely because the underlying issue isn't behavioral, it's hormonal. And the cruelest part of the melatonin story is that the melatonin disruption then feeds back into the cortisol disruption. If melatonin is low and sleep is fragmented, the cortisol awakening response the next day is affected, partly because the recovery sleep architecture that normally allows the HPA axis to reset during the night has been disrupted, which affects morning energy, which then affects capacity to manage stress during the day, which then in turn elevates evening cortisol, which suppresses melatonin the following evening. The systems are tightly coupled, and when one destabilizes, it tends to pull the others with it as well. And the third mechanism is what happens to temperature regulation. This one tends to be more familiar because it's where hot flushes and night sweats live, but it's worth understanding it as a circadian issue rather than just a symptom, because that reframe changes how you approach it. So your core body temperature follows a circadian rhythm. It peaks in the late afternoon, typically around 4 and 6, and then drops in the evening as you prepare for sleep. And reaches its minimum in the early hours of the night, somewhere between 2 and 5 a.m. for most people, and begins rising again in the morning as part of the waking signal. That temperature rhythm is deeply integrated with your sleep-wake cycle. So the drop in temperature in the evening is part of what initiates sleep onset. It's not merely correlated with going to sleep, it's mechanistically involved in triggering the processes that allow sleep to deepen. So the rise in the morning is part of what promotes the transition out of sleep and into waking alertness. Estrogen's involved in thermal regulation through its effects on the thermoneutral zone, the range of body temperatures within which the brain isn't triggered to produce a strong cooling or heating response. So when estrogen is adequate, this zone is relatively wide. Small fluctuations in body temperature don't trigger strong thermoregulatory responses, but when estrogen declines, the thermoneutral zone narrows, and the same small temperature fluctuation that would previously have been tolerated without triggering a response now crosses that threshold, and your body tries to cool down aggressively, and that's what a hot flush is. So at night, when the cooling response involves sweating, it's that night sweat that wakes you up. And the circadian relevance here is twofold. So firstly, the night sweats and temperature disruptions don't just interrupt sleep in the moment, they fragment the temperature rhythm itself, which is one of the key signals that helps anchor the circadian clock. So you lose the clean, sustained drop in temperature that should be supporting deep sleep, and you lose the reliable, gradual rise in the morning that marks the natural end of the sleep phase. The clock becomes less crisp because one of its most important anchoring signals, core body temperature, has become noisy and disrupted. And secondly, the temperature disruption interacts with the melatonin disruption. Core body temperature drop is part of what allows melatonin to rise effectively in the evening. When the thermoregulatory system is dysregulated, the temperature signal that supports the melatonin rise becomes unreliable, and you get a flatter or delayed melatonin response, not only because of the direct estrogenic effects on the pineal gland, but because the temperature cue that normally reinforces the melatonin signal is also compromised. And I want to add something specific as well about the melatonin story that often surprises people because it connects to something practical. So melatonin is frequently discussed as though it's primarily a sleep hormone, something your body makes to help you fall asleep. But its role is actually much broader than that, and understanding the fuller picture helps explain why reduced melatonin production during perimenopause has effects that extend well beyond difficulty falling asleep. So melatonin is produced not just in the pineal gland, but in many tissues throughout the body, and it functions as a powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory signal. It's involved in immune regulation, in mitochondrial function, in the timing of cellular repair processes, and the nightly melatonin peak doesn't just tell your brain it's time to sleep, it tells your entire body to run its maintenance routines. When the melatonin peak is lower or shorter, those maintenance routines are less efficiently executed. And this may be part of why perimenopausal women often notice changes in how quickly they recover from illness or physical exertion, in skin and tissue quality, in the sense of cumulative low-grade fatigue that doesn't resolve with sleep. This may be part of why perimenopausal women often notice changes in how quickly they recover from illness or physical exertion, in skin and tissue quality, in the sense of cumulative low-grade fatigue that doesn't resolve with sleep. The sleep is fragmented and the repair signal that normally accompanies it is diminished. There's also a specific relationship between melatonin and core temperature that's worth understanding as well, because it connects the second and third mechanisms directly. So melatonin helps facilitate the core temperature drop that's necessary for sleep onset and deep sleep. But when melatonin production is reduced, the temperature drop is less pronounced and less sustained, which means that even on nights when there are no obvious night sweats, the perimenopausal women may be getting shallower sleep, partly because the temperature drop that supports deep sleep is insufficient, not just because the thermoregulatory system is dysregulated, but because the melatonin that would normally reinforce that temperature drop is less abundant. So the three mechanisms that I've described are not really three separate mechanisms. They're more like three aspects of a single connected disruption, each one amplifying the effects of the others. Dysregulated cortisol affects sleep architecture, reduced melatonin deepens the sleep fragmentation and weakens the temperature signal. The temperature disruption then increases arousal frequency during the night, which further fragments sleep and further dysregulates cortisol the following day. The loop runs in all directions simultaneously. And on top of this, the accumulated sleep debt from repeatedly fragmented nights reduces the resilience of every other system. Cognitive function is impaired, appetite regulation is disrupted, sleep-deprived people have higher ghrelin and lower leptin, which drives hunger and makes it harder to feel satisfied. The nervous system's capacity to manage stress is reduced, which means the already elevated evening cortisol gets worse. And when women describe feeling like everything has become unpredictable, like energy, sleep, mood, appetite, cognitive function, this is the underlying architecture of that unpredictability. So three interacting mechanisms, each destabilizing the others, all rooted in the same upstream change, which is estrogen declining and taking some of the circadian system's internal stabilisation with it. I want to stay with that experience for a moment because I think the gap between what the science describes and what it actually feels like to live through it is where a lot of women get stuck. And I want to try to close that gap, because hearing your own experience described accurately can be genuinely clarifying, and it can shift the frame from something's wrong with me to I understand what's happening and I know what to do about it now. The sleep piece almost always comes up first. The pattern I hear most often isn't difficulty falling asleep, though that's there sometimes. It's waking in the early hours, usually somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, and being unable to get back to sleep easily. Often there's a sensation of warmth or heat, sometimes not quite a full night sweat, but an uncomfortable internal temperature that makes sleep impossible. Sometimes there's a racing quality to the mind, and thoughts that wouldn't normally feel significant at 2 p.m. feel suddenly urgent at 3 a.m. And then eventually sleep returns, but shallow and unrefreshing, and the alarm goes off at a point that feels like the middle of the night. And what's important to understand about that pattern, and what I find most women haven't been told, is that the early waking with heat isn't a separate sleep issue layered on top of a hormonal issue. It's a hormonal issue expressing itself through the circadian system. The narrowed thermoneutral zone is triggering a temperature response that's waking you at exactly the point in the night when the melatonin that should be keeping you asleep is least robust. These two mechanisms are interacting, and addressing only the sleep hygiene without understanding the underlying disruption is why the usual sleep hygiene advice often doesn't produce the results women would expect. The morning energy piece is where I most often see the confusion about effort and effectiveness. So women who've been doing morning light, genuinely doing it consistently for months, describe a period when it was clearly helping, followed by a period where it seems to have stopped making the same difference. They haven't changed what they're doing, but the result has changed. And because there's no obvious explanation for why an effective intervention would suddenly stop being effective, the conclusion they tend to reach, often without saying it directly, is that maybe it was never really doing much, or maybe they're just not someone for whom it works. And that interpretation is understandable, and it's almost certainly wrong. What's more likely is what I described earlier. The morning light is still delivering the calibration signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but the hormonal environment that was amplifying and translating that signal into a robust cortisol awakening response is less stable than it was. The signal is reaching its destination, but the receiver has become less reliable. And without understanding that, the woman keeps doing morning light with diminishing returns and eventually may stop at exactly the moment when it matters most. The language I hear around cognitive function tends to be particularly specific, and I found it's worth listening carefully to how women describe this, because the words they choose often reveal what's actually happening. They almost never describe it as stupidity or inability. They describe it as inconsistency. They were sharp yesterday, but they can't hold a thread today. They gave a presentation last week that went well and they felt like themselves, but this week they can't find the word for something they know perfectly well. And the thing that's distressing isn't the bad day specifically. It's not knowing which kind of day it's going to be. So I can't plan around myself is a phrase I hear in different forms quite often, or I don't know what version of me is going to show up. For women who have built their professional identities and sense of self in part around being reliable and high functioning, that unpredictability is deeply unsettling in a way that goes beyond practical inconvenience. What's useful to know about the cognitive inconsistency is that it's almost always downstream of sleep and cortisol disruption rather than a direct effect of estrogen on cognitive function itself, though there are some direct estrogenic effects on neuroplasticity and neurotransmitter function. So the mornings where the cortisol awakening response fires well, where the sleep architecture wasn't too badly disrupted the night before, tend to be the sharper days. The days that follow a fragmented night with an early wake where the cortisol response was blunted or poorly timed are the foggy ones, which is why it feels so unpredictable. It's not random, but the determining factors aren't things most women can see or control directly. And then there's the frustration of doing it right. So I want to spend a moment on this specifically because I think it's the part that does the most damage if it isn't addressed. And there's a particular kind of demoralization that comes from applying knowledge and effort and not getting the expected return. It's different from the demoralization of not knowing what to do. It's the demoralization of knowing what to do, doing it, and watching it not working the way it should. And if you don't understand why the same inputs are producing different outputs, the natural conclusion is that you must be doing something wrong, or that the approach itself was flawed, or that your body is somehow uniquely uncooperative. And none of those conclusions are accurate. The accurate explanation is simpler and more forgiving. The physiological context has changed. Perimenopause hasn't made the interventions wrong. It's shifted the threshold for what counts as sufficient. The woman doing morning light every day in stable hormonal conditions needed to do it most days to maintain the benefit. But the same woman in perimenopause needs to do it every day with fewer gaps, with longer duration on grey days, because the system it's supporting has less internal resilience. The intervention is still right, but the dose needs to be adjusted. So the reframe from it isn't working to the threshold has shifted is the most practically useful thing I can offer to a woman in this situation. Because once she understands the mechanism, she can stop second guessing the approach and start adjusting the application. And that's a very different psychological position to be in. There's one more thing that I hear that I want to address, and it's perhaps the most important because it's the thing that undermines women's efforts the most. It's the tendency when things become inconsistent to back off, to give themselves more flexibility, to stop holding the morning routine quite as firmly because it doesn't seem to be paying off the way it used to let meal timing slide because they're tired and the effort doesn't feel worth it. And I understand this completely. When something stops producing the results it used to, pulling back is a rational response. But during perimenopause, this is precisely backwards. The inconsistency isn't a sign that the foundation is working less well. It's a sign that the circadian rhythm needs the foundation more than it did before. So loosening the structure at the moment when the system has least internal resilience removes the scaffolding at the moment when it's most load-bearing. And the women I see navigating this transition most smoothly are the ones who, when things become inconsistent and unreliable, tighten their grip on the foundations rather than loosening it. Not in a sort of discipline exercise way, but as a practical response to a changed physiological reality. So the clock has less margin, it needs more consistent input to compensate for that reduced margin. So let me be concrete about how the perimenopausal context changes, or rather sharpens, the approach to everything we've covered in this series so far. Morning light, well, this matters more, not less. The circadian clock has lost some of its internal estrogenic support, which means the internal light signals becomes proportionally more important. And you're not replacing estrogen with morning light, that's not the mechanism, but you are providing the most powerful external Zeitgeber, as we call it. It's a time giver that your clock has available. And in the absence of robust internal hormonal stabilisation, the external signals carry more of the load. So in practice, this means morning light during perimenopause should be non-negotiable rather than mostly consistent. It means the winter context we talked about last week matters even more. And a perimenopausal woman in a northern climate in January is dealing with a less robust clock in a less supportive light environment. And that combination asks for more deliberate effort. Not dramatically more, just more consistent, fewer skipped days, and longer duration on grey days. So for meal timing, the circadian leptin connection we covered in episode 4 is particularly relevant here. So estrogen's decline affects leptin sensitivity and the hypothalamic pathways that regulate appetite and energy balance. The irregularity that might have been tolerable before, skipping breakfast on some days, eating late a few nights a week, is less tolerable now because the system's already under hormonal pressure. So consistent meal timing during perimenopause is one of the highest leverage things you can do, precisely because it's one of the external signals your peripheral clocks can depend on when the internal hormonal environment has become less predictable. It's also worth noting that the metabolic changes of perimenopause, changes in insulin sensitivity, in fat distribution, in appetite regulation, are partly circadian in their origin. So irregular meal timing during a period of already disrupted circadian signaling compounds metabolic dysregulation in ways that wouldn't have been as consequential earlier in life. The woman who could skip breakfast and eat late at night without it noticeably affecting her weight or energy may find that the same pattern in perimenopause produces noticeably different results. And that's definitely not purely a calorie story, it's also a circadian story. And then there's evening light management, so the narrowed thermoneutral zone and more fragile melatonin production during perimenopause makes evening light exposure more disruptive than it was before. So if you were getting away with some screen use late in the evening without it significantly affecting your sleep, that margin probably doesn't exist in the same way during perimenopause. The melatonin suppression from evening blue light hits a system that's already producing melatonin less robustly, and the disruption is amplified. This doesn't mean you can never look at a screen after 8. It means the cost of doing so regularly is higher than it used to be. It's worth knowing that so you can make an informed choice rather than wondering why your sleep is fragile. And it also connects back to the temperature piece. Blue light exposure in the evening suppresses melatonin, which delays the core temperature drop, which pushes back sleep onset, which means you're getting less of the deep early night sleep that's most important for physical recovery and cortisol resetting. In a system that's already under hormonal pressure, that chain of effects is worth taking seriously. And there's also nervous system regulation, which I've talked about before. The HPA axis, the system that governs your cortisol response, is less well regulated during perimenopause because estrogen normally helps buffer the stress response. What this means practically is that chronic sympathetic activation, the kind that comes from sustained high demand with insufficient recovery, hits harder during this transition than it did before. The cortisol dysregulation that contributes to 3 a.m. waking, to afternoon energy crashes, to the wired but tired feeling, all of this is amplified by a nervous system that has lost some of its hormonal buffering. So the nervous system piece isn't a nice to have during perimenopause, it's load bearing. Genuine parasympathetic recovery, not just sitting on the sofa scrolling, but actual nervous system downregulation needs to happen more deliberately and more frequently, with short practices during the day and a deliberate wind down in the evening, protecting whatever it is that genuinely shifts you out of activation and into rest. One thing I'd also add about the nervous system piece that often gets overlooked is that the perimenopausal woman is often simultaneously at a point in her life where demand is at its peak. So there might be career responsibilities, caring for teenagers or young adults, sometimes caring for aging parents, often managing the most complex household logistics of her life. And the external demands haven't softened at exactly the moment when the internal hormonal buffering has reduced. And that's a real squeeze. And I'm not suggesting those external demands should simply be dropped or that saying no more often is a simple fix, but understanding that the nervous system during perimenopause is working with less hormonal support does mean that the recovery practices that might have been optional in your 30s are genuinely necessary now. Not a luxury, but as a biological requirement for the system to keep functioning well. The thread connecting all of this is the same. So perimenopause narrows your margin. The interventions you've been building across this series are the right ones, but during the perimenopausal transition, they need to be applied with more consistency and less willingness to let things slide, because life getting demanding, which it will because your life is full, is precisely when the circadian anchor matters most. I want to be clear about something because I think there's a version of this message that lands in a way that I don't intend it to. So I'm not saying perimenopause is something you have to manage perfectly or that any inconsistency will drain you. I'm not saying that you need to add more protocols to an already full life. And I'm not saying any of this instead of HRT. That's a separate conversation between you and your doctor, and for many women it's an entirely appropriate and helpful intervention. What I'm saying is that the circadian foundation matters regardless of what else you decide to do. HRT can restore some of the estrogenic support of the circadian clock. There's research suggesting it does, both directly through the mechanisms I've described and indirectly through reducing the vasomotor symptoms that fragment sleep. But it doesn't change the underlying reality that your body clock needs external anchoring signals, and that those signals become more rather than less important as the internal hormonal environment shifts. The women I see who navigate perimenopause most smoothly aren't the ones who have the most elaborate protocols. They're the ones who have made a small number of foundational things genuinely non-negotiable. So morning light, consistent meal timing, a real wind down in the evening, some form of deliberate nervous system recovery. These aren't adding to their life's demands. They are the things that make everything else more manageable. And women who struggle most, in my observation, are the ones who are doing everything right in the spaces between stress, but whose circadian anchor disappears the moment life gets demanding, because during perimenopause, the system can't absorb that disruption the way it used to. The buffer is smaller, the recovery takes longer, the 2 consecutive disrupted nights during a stressful week can set off a cascade that takes 10 days to fully resolve, whereas before it might have resolved in 2 or 3. And that's not a moral failing, it's a physiological reality. And knowing that means you can protect the foundations when you know a demanding period is coming, rather than just letting them go exactly when you most need them. So the message isn't do more, the message is make the foundations more robust so they hold when things get hard, because things will get hard, and your biology during this transition needs you to be consistent more than it needs you to be perfect. So just to give you some concrete steps here, specific to the perimenopausal context, the first thing is to treat morning light as non-negotiable rather than mostly consistent. So during perimenopause, the clock has less internal hormonal stabilisation, which means the external light signals carries more of the anchoring load, and missing days has more downstream consequence than it did before. So this doesn't mean every skipped morning is a crisis. It just means that making it genuinely part of your non-negotiable morning rather than something you do when the conditions are convenient. Secondly, anchor your meal timing more consistently. So breakfast within an hour of waking if possible every single day. Last meal by 7 or 8 in the evening most days. Not because the timing was less important before, it always was important, but because the peripheral clock synchronization that meal timing provides is doing more of the stabilizing work when estrogen is less available to support it from the inside. Thirdly, take your evening light management seriously. So the melatonin system is more fragile during perimenopause, and thermoregulation disruption that contributes to night sweats and early waking is worsened by evening blue light exposure. So dim lights after sunset, screens off or filtered as well wherever possible, and this is all about protecting the part of your night that's already under pressure. And fourthly, identify what genuinely shifts your nervous system into parasympathetic mode and do it deliberately every day. So not scrolling, not watching something that actually downregulates your stress response, like breathing practices, gentle movement, time outside in the afternoon, whatever works specifically for you. The HPA axis has less hormonal buffering during perimenopause, so deliberate recovery is not optional. Fifth, if you're waking in the early hours with heat, then try dropping your bedroom temperature as low as is comfortable before sleeping. So the narrowed thermoneutral zone means smaller temperature fluctuations trigger larger responses. So keeping the room cooler reduces the frequency of the threshold being crossed, and this won't solve the underlying hormonal picture, but it can reduce the frequency of disruptions that fragment your sleep. And sixth is to lower your threshold for consistency, not your standards. The goal during perimenopause isn't doing these things more, it's doing them more reliably. A consistent 8 out of 10 is more valuable than a brilliant 10 out of 10 followed by a collapse. So the clock needs the repetition to stay anchored. I also want to be honest about the timeline here, because the perimenopausal context makes the typical week-by-week progression less linear than usual. So the circadian interventions during perimenopause are working against a moving target. So your hormonal environment isn't stable, it's fluctuating sometimes dramatically, and those fluctuations will affect how you feel regardless of what you're doing. There will be weeks when the circadian work seems to be paying off clearly. There will be weeks when you feel like you're back to square one, and that's not the interventions failing, that's the underlying hormonal variability expressing itself. So what tends to happen over 4 to 8 weeks of genuine consistency is that the floor rises. The worst days become less bad, the fragmented nights become less frequent, the energy crashes become less severe. You're not eliminating the variability, you're reducing its amplitude. So you're giving the system more of what it needs to recover more quickly when the hormonal environment shifts. And women often describe this not as a dramatic improvement, but as a quieter, more gradual sense that the worst is less frequent, that the recovery between difficult weeks is faster, and that they have a little bit more of themselves available on the harder days. So over 3 to 6 months, the pattern becomes clearer, the circadian anchor is holding even when the hormonal environment fluctuates. You have more predictability, more resilience, more capacity to absorb the difficult weeks without losing the foundation entirely. But I also want to be direct that this is not a straight line. So perimenopause is not a straight line. The work you're doing is building resilience in a system that's genuinely under pressure, and that matters enormously. It just doesn't always feel like that in the moment. So everything stopped working in your 40s. Well, it's not because the interventions are wrong. It's not because your body has failed or because you've lost something you can't get back. It's because estrogen was quietly doing a stabilizing job in your circadian system that nobody told you about. And as it declines, the clock becomes less robust. The same inputs produce less consistent outputs, and the margin for inconsistency narrows as well, which means that the direction of travel is the same: morning light, consistent meal timing, evening light management, nervous system recovery. These aren't wrong because they're less reliable than they used to be. They're more important. They're what you have available to provide external stabilisation that estrogen used to partly provide internally. So you haven't lost your ability to feel well, but you're navigating a genuine physiological transition with less margin than you had before. And that asks for consistency more than it asks for perfection. And that is something that you can give it. So if you want the full picture of how everything in this series connects, and specifically how to sequence the interventions for your situation, including if you're in perimenopause, I have a free masterclass at francesnorgate.com/masterclass. And the Quantum Nourishment Blueprint, which opens this spring, takes all of this and puts it in order with implementation detail and troubleshooting and support built in as well. So if that's something you want to be the first to hear about, the waitlist is on my website at francesnorgate.com/waitlist. And if you're not already in the free weekly newsletter, Quantum Nourishment Weekly, I give one practical circadian strategy a week about what I'm reading or what I'm noticing. That's also on my website, francesnorgate.com/resources or francesnorgate.substack.com. Next week, we're going to talk about why you wake up wired at night, even when you're exhausted all day. That kind of pushed out feeling, tired by 9, somehow wide awake by 11. It's not insomnia and it's not just stress. It's your cortisol curve inverting in the evening, and it has a specific mechanism and a specific fix. So we'll get into that one next week. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you next week.